I now know that my middle prefrontal cortex and limbic system figured this out so that it is they that know what to do, or more importantly, what not to do with the information I am getting from my mirror neurons. But before the I didn't say the punchline yet, wait. You people are into my sarcasm beyond before the explosion of neuroscientific data, we used to call this kind of thoughtful behavior clinical experience. That's the punchline. Now, I want to close my talk with a slightly more feel-good vignette than that of Marie. Although this next vignette may leave you with a touch of empathic nausea. I'm just And I'm also going to make a final confession here that I do not really understand. I do not really understand how our bioenergetic approach and the data of neuroscience map onto each other unless, that is, the correlations are anchored in the details of a somatic psychotherapy process. I'm going to repeat that sentence. I do not really understand how our bioenergetic approach and the data of neuroscience map onto each other unless, that is, the correlations which we're mapping are anchored in the details of an actual somatic psychotherapy process. On the one hand, I grew up with the Reichian amoeba model. You weren't born, most of you, when we all believed in that. And that was that we trillion-celled humans, as Dr. Lowen wrote, quote, function on the organismic level as a single cell. Dr. Lowen continued. On the deepest level, the organismic functions are expansion and contraction, taking in and giving forth. This is the end of the quote. Now, I believe that this model is at the base of how I actually work with my patients. On the other hand, I hope that my working clinical model actually includes more of the parts of the body and their functions that belong to the species that come into my office, Homo sapiens, rather than amoebas. So, some of you may remember the phrase, back to basics, as Dr. Lowen used to say. Sorry, Scott, sorry. We come from our core. I'm now talking about the basics. And when the core impulse is frustrated by the environment, we develop armor, which traps the impulse and the various emotions. When I do bioenergetic therapy, I behave as though the emotions and impulses are indeed trapped in the muscles and tissues of the body of the person I'm working with. If a patient feels a lump forming in his throat or an ache in his heart, I understand that his subjective experience is happening in the physical tissues of his body, and I work with him accordingly. Now, I'm making a little inference here, but bear with me. Dr. Siegel, on the other hand, tells us what I believe any self-respecting neuroscience expert would. He says, neural networks surrounding the hollow organs, such as the intestines and the heart, send complex sensory input to the skull-based brain. Dr. Siegel says the brain is, of course, throughout the body in the peripheral nervous system, but here he emphasizes that the messages go up to the skull-based brain. This data, he says, forms the foundation for visceral maps that help us to have a gut feeling or a heartfelt sense. Now, I'm really emphasizing these quotation marks. I think it's interesting that they are standing there around gut feeling and heartfelt. And if I can catch him tomorrow, I will ask Dr. Siegel if the quotation marks suggest that the feeling is not actually going on in the body tissues of the gut and the heart. Because why would you have quotation marks otherwise? So I already think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. It is counterintuitive for me to believe that the determinative action is going on in a skull-based brain, as opposed to also happening in the tissues of the heart and throat. As for my patient, Charles, who is gradually coming down from his mind as the location of his false self, and finally feeling something in his chest and throat, he needs me to be attuned to what he is finally tuned into in himself, right there where it's happening. In therapy with me for almost 5 years, Charles is 40 years old, and although a very high-functioning guy in his career, he has never had an intimate partner. He is intermittently hypochondriacal and recently had a week-long episode of chest pain for which no medical cause could be found. He describes his life as a slow-motion panic attack. Standing with knees bent or leaning forward in the elephant position, he easily gets into strong dizziness and nausea. Leaning back over the bioenergetic roller, Charles has on occasion heard the very distant wail of a young child. 2 weeks ago, while lying back over the roller, Charles said that he felt like pushing out the junk that was inside his belly and chest. I suggested that he try to vocalize the sustained exhalation. As he tried to do so, he felt something moving up the front of his body and getting caught in his throat. For a few seconds, I put some pressure on his thyroid membrane, which is fibrous tissue just above the Adam's apple, and with my other hand, I pressed down gently on the front of Charles's chest. His voiced exhalation began to come out, and over a period of about a minute, the sound became fuller, and there was a rhythmic pulse to it. It pulsed from somewhere deep inside of him. The life of his sound and the sound of his life filled the room. After a few minutes in disbelief, Charles said, "I did not make that sound." He was truly stunned, and as you might say, the three of us, me, Charles, and whatever it was that was coming out of him, sat quietly together. And I was a bit hopeful that Charles was getting close to becoming intimate with himself. 3 days ago, he came in the day before I left, and we went back over the roller. We looked at each other for a couple of minutes. He finally said to me, I don't know how to make that sound. I need your help." And he reminded me that what had really opened him up was that while I was massaging the strap muscles at the back of his neck, he reminded me that I had forgotten about my cephalic shock construct. I was actually supporting the weight of his head. And as he said, I don't know, I can't explain it, but when you were holding me like that, something in those muscles lets go. And so the moral of this entire paper is that sometimes a person really is an amoeba, especially if the therapy involves working with his body. I thank you.